So last week we covered the fact that Esther is born Jewish, right? So she's a Hebrew, an Israelite, but they live during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, right? This is after Babylon. So Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, they had come in, they had taken over Israel and brought in the captives, right? That's what Nebuchadnezzar did. He would bring in the best and the brightest. That's like Daniel and all those guys, not that Daniel, a different Daniel. And but we talked about Daniel a while ago, didn't we? Remember? Because that was like a joke every night. And so Esther is in this. Now, during the days of like Ezra and Nehemiah, some of them got to go back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the walls. They rebuilt like a second temple like Solomon's. And they did all of these things. But some of the Israelites stayed, right? They stayed in the provinces of Persia. And so the king that we talked about, the King James and the New King James, they call him King, Ahasuerus. I think. I mean, it's something like that. Ahasuerus is what we're going to call him, though. Now, we would know him in history as, anybody remember that? Starts with an X. Xerxes. Yes, King Xerxes. So Xerxes has a wife. Her name is Vashti. She is the queen, obviously, since he is the king. He has like this 6-month party where he brings in all these leaders and military leaders and all these people from the other provinces in his nation. And he displays his wealth. He gives them all kinds of things. And pretty much he's saying, eventually we're going to go into Greece and we're going to go after them. And he's kind of displaying what he will give them. And then at the end of this 6 months, we talked about all this last week, he has a 7-day like party. And there's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of bad things most likely going on. And then he decides it's a great idea, remember this, to call in his wife. He's like, I'm going to display my wife before all these drunken men, which is what every wife wants to happen to her. And so she says, no, I'm not going to do that, which is like a bold move because you don't do that when your husband is the king. And I'm not making any jokes, I was going to. But you don't do that when your husband's the king. And so his like wise men, who apparently are very wise, they say, well, this is a problem because your wife didn't obey you. The other women in the kingdom will hear this and they won't obey us. Which, again, so he says, they say, you've got to make a decree that all the women have to respect their wives. And you've got to banish Vashti. So she's like banished. She's no longer queen. Right? So then we picked up the story last week and really read from Esther chapter 2 when 4 years have passed and the king is sad and he remembers Vashti, and then his wise men again come and they say, hey, let's just take a bunch of women from all of the provinces. And this is a big empire. Take as many women as we can find, the beautiful women, and we're going to bring them in and then you pick. And so they wind up with like 400 women and the king's going to pick one of them. And they go through like a year of beauty treatments and they live in like special quarters, and Esther is one of these women. Not by choice, right? Not because she desires. We don't read anything about any of these women like being like, ooh, I volunteer. It's like, no, they're taken and they're brought. And I don't think they had a choice, right? And because this is the way things work in this time. So Esther's one of them. We read this last week that as soon as she gets in, she finds favor with one of the eunuchs. He puts her in a special place in the house. He gives her 7 of like her own kind of like servants to help her. And he knows, what the king likes and all these things. And she just finds favor like with everybody wherever she goes. Well, Mordecai, I'm going to like abbreviate all of this as quickly as I can. Mordecai is Esther's, not uncle, cousin. He's like her older cousin. Her parents have passed away. He's her older cousin. He takes care of her. He takes walks every day to kind of hear how Esther's doing. How's it going? How are things? Is she okay? And all of those things. And but Mordecai sits at the gate a lot, right? Like this is part of his job most likely. And so he sits here, and one day, if you were to read the end of chapter 2, there is a plot by 2 men who were doorkeepers for the king, like they stood like at his door, and they were upset with King Xerxes or King Ahasuerus, and so they develop an assassination plot. Mordecai hears about it. Mordecai sends word to his cousin Esther, who happens to be the queen at this point, and she sends it to Ahasuerus. They find out it's true. She gives credit to Mordecai. So if you read the end of Esther chapter 2, it says, when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on gallows. That's the guys that were going to assassinate the king. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So there's like a history being written about King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes, right? So we continue on down the road, and after a while, and we're not really going to read chapter 3 today either, but there's a guy that comes up and his name is Haman. Haman becomes the right-hand man to the king. He's like his first advisor. And Haman has a lot of authority, and what happens is wherever Haman goes, Haman walks around and people just like bow down to him because he has the authority of the king. Well, Mordecai is like, I don't bow down to people. Like, that's not what he does. And if you read into their culture a little, some people would argue that the reason that Mordecai doesn't bow down is because he's Jewish. And they don't bow down before people unless they're bowing before God. Well, this just infuriates Haman. And he decides, in fact, to this day, you know, the Jewish people still celebrate the feast of Purim, or I don't know exactly how you say that because different people say it different ways. It's Purim. And when they tell stories, the story goes that when they talk about Haman, the Agagite, the people, like the kids, they like boo and hiss. Like to this day. So they say like in Haman, and they're like, spoosh. So I don't know, it's interesting. We could all do that, but we don't have to. It's okay. If we were in my class, I'd totally make him do it though, but that's all right. I won't make you do that. So Mordecai doesn't bow down. Haman is infuriated. He's mad. So he decides it's not good enough that he get rid of Mordecai. He wants to get rid of the Jewish people. Like all of them. He wants to have a mass genocide. And so he goes to the king and he says, hey, king, we've got some people living in your provinces. They live all throughout your provinces, and they don't follow our rituals. Like, they don't do things the way we do. So before this, they had cast lots to see like when they would get rid of them, and the lots were like 1 year from this time. So he said, here's what we do. I need you to send out a decree. You got to sign it by your ring, and it's got to go to all the provinces that a year from now, we're going to kill all the Jews. This isn't the only time that people have tried to wipe Jews off the face of the earth. It's happened several times throughout the Old Testament and even in more modern history that we know of. So anyway, and he says, and we'll give you, how much did he say? I wrote it down over here, but it's 10,000 talents of like silver, which some would say is like 375 tons of silver. That's a lot of silver. I don't know what that equals, or 340 metric tons of silver in weight. Yeah, I don't know what that would be worth exactly, but it's a lot of silver. It sounds like a lot of silver, 375 tons. So he's like, we'll put that into the treasury. And so the king's like, okay, that's great. We add to the treasury. He apparently doesn't care about like killing off like thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but he gives his seal. This goes out. Well, Mordecai, again, who is Jewish, here's the news. Esther has no idea. And mind you, at this point, Esther has not revealed her nationality to anybody. Mordecai actually told her not to. He said, if you reveal this, it may not go well with you, right? You guys remember this part of the story? So Mordecai goes about like wailing and yelling through the streets, and he's like upset. Well, some other people hear about this. They tell Esther. This grieves Esther. So she sends out a guy to give him some like fresh clothes so he's not like in sackcloth anymore. Mordecai rejects it. And this is kind of where we pick up our story today in Esther chapter 4, because Mordecai sends word to Esther, and he's essentially saying what we've been learning all along is that she didn't have a choice but to go and be she wound up as the queen because she found favor, but she was like taken and brought to this place. She didn't sign up for any of this. But Mordecai says, perhaps, just perhaps, there's a reason that you are where you are. So in Esther chapter 4, and I think I gave you verse 10, but in verse 9 it says, so Hathach, that's Esther's like servant, returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants, verse 11, and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So again, it sounds like they have a wonderful marriage. She hasn't seen the king in 30 days. Some of you are like, I don't know, that sounds pretty great to me. We won't go there though. And you have Mordecai has told her, you are where you are. You have influence. You have some power. You can go to the king and say, you sign this decree and it's going to wipe out all these people. Your people, Esther. And she's like, what am I supposed to do? The king hasn't sent for me in 30 days. And if I go into the inner court and he doesn't hold out his golden scepter, I'll die. Any man or woman will die. Well, we already know he banished Vashti. We know he cares a lot about his image. So So she says, he hasn't called for me to go into the king these 30 days. Verse 12, so they told Mordecai Esther's words. Verse 13, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this, which is probably the most famous passage in all of Esther. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, that's the capital, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded. So she's like, if I go into the king, I could die. Mordecai goes, you're going to die. Are you going to escape it? The Lord's still going to, Mordecai, we know that these are God's chosen people, but we also know that in the book of Esther, God's name is never mentioned. There's no recorded prayer to God, although she does ask them to fast for 3 days, so that's obviously alluding to something. But Mordecai is saying, look, God's going to deliver us either way. Maybe he put you in place to do this. Who knows, he says. And I love the language. He's like, who knows? Maybe you were put where you are at this place in time for such a time as this. And she's saying, I can't do this. That's not, I'm going to die. And then she has a change of heart and she says, I'll go and do it. And if I perish, I perish. She had resolve at this moment. And it was like, yeah, you're right. We're just going to go and we're going to do it. And now we know the rest of the story, and I'm going to, again, sort of abbreviate that for us here because we'd have to read 5 more chapters. And we could try it, but I don't know how long you all want to be here. So anyway, Esther agrees to help the Jews. It's her people. So Esther goes in chapter 5. She decides to go in. What verse did I give you? Verse 9 of 5? Oh, I gave you the whole chapter. Okay. Well, let's just start reading then. Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes, the 3rd day after their fasting, and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. So again, we see this with Esther everywhere she goes. There's just favor. She found favor with Haggai when she's first brought up and she has all this special treatment that's given to her. She has favor with the king in this moment. And he says, what is it? What do you desire? Whatever it is, up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. And so she answered, verse 4, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. So the king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. Then Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. So she still doesn't give him a request. Now, I don't know the reason for this. She doesn't know Haman's whole plot at this point, but it is amazing, again, that while we don't see God mentioned necessarily, we see God working out literally all of these details. So I love verse 9. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. He's excited. He's I get invited. It's just me, the queen, and the king. And then she's like, hey, we're going to have another banquet tomorrow. I want Haman to come. He's like, this is fantastic. I am so happy. I am a special person. They must be going to do something special for me. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. So he's walking out. He is happy. He's I'm going to a banquet tomorrow with the king and the queen. I am a big deal. And then he sees Mordecai and he's Mordecai. He's his arch enemy, right? And so nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the queen to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. He's pumped. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So his wife, apparently very wise as well, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet, and the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So he's like, hey, that's a great idea. So what we'll do is we're going to have these gallows made. Now, some translations interpret this as like a pole to impale him on. Some read it as a hanging. Either way, we know they're, 50 cubits high, which is, they say, is about 75 feet. So like he's making a spectacle of this, right? Like he wants people to see this apparently. And apparently it's not far from like the king's house either, as we'll read in a moment. But he's like, so before I go to the banquet tomorrow, I'll go up to the king and I'll be like, hey, look, we'll still wait the year to wipe out all the Jews, but I can't take Mordecai anymore. We got to take him out today. Can I get your permission to do that? So we got to keep reading because you just have to read it. It'll be better if we read it than if I tell it. 6 verse 1. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So the king is restless. He can't sleep. You ever like not been able to sleep? Yeah. I don't know. I don't read a book when I can't sleep. I don't know what I do. I stare at the ceiling and don't do anything. But so the king, he's like, hey, come like read my history to me. It's just funny. He's like, just like come and read about how great I am to me. And it was found written. They just happened to be in this part of his history. It was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, these were the two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So the king said, who is in the court? So like, Haman's rolling up now, right? Like the gallows are being built. You get the picture. The king's like looks out and he's like, hey, who's walking up right now? And they're, oh, it's Haman. And so the king goes, hey man, come on in. You get that? See what I did there? It was stupid. It was really stupid. Nobody even got it anyway, right? Like, hey man, get it? Haman, hey man. Okay. All right. Who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So these have been being built overnight apparently. The king's servant said to him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now here, this is perfect.